Hello, my name is Lee Presser. This is my show. I speak frequently to very interesting people. Some of these conversations are so exciting, so intellectually stimulating, I thought others might like to listen in. This is the reason we started recording Conversation with Lee Presser.
Welcome to Conversation with Lee Presser. U.S. Route 66 was one of the original highways within the United States Highway System. Route 66 was established on November 11, 1926. The highway, which became one of the most famous roads in America, originally ran from Chicago, Illinois to Santa Monica, California, covering a total of 2,448 miles. Route 66 served as a major path for those who migrated west in the 1930s. It supported the economies of communities through which it passed. A generation later, those same communities withered when the new Interstate Highway System bypassed them. Route 66 was officially removed from the United States Highway System on June the 27th, 1985. Portions of the road that pass through Illinois, Missouri, New Mexico, and Arizona have been designated a National Scenic Byway. Our guest today is a Route 66 historian, author, blogger, and roadie, Cheryl Eichar Jett. Her writing is mostly lighthearted look at traveling along Route 66, its history, its tourism. Ms. Jett serves as president of the Illinois Route 66 Blue Carpet Corridor Coalition and recently served as conference director of the Miles of Possibilities Route 66 Conference in Edwardsville, Illinois. Today we will be learning more about the romance of Route 66. Cheryl Eichar Jett, welcome to Conversation.
Thank you, Lee. It's good to be here.
So, how'd you get into Route 66?
I grew up along Route 66. I've lived in Illinois all my life, and I've lived in several Route 66 communities, and most recently in Edwardsville. It was always there. It was always in the background. And I love to write.
Well, it was Route 66 when we were growing up.
It was. It
Yes.
truly was. And I had always loved to write. I'd always loved history. And some years back, I started doing community histories for Arcadia Publishing. And I just sort of backed into the whole Route 66 thing. I found it was still there in the background for the stories that I was attempting to tell. And it's a wonderful background. And that's how I got completely hooked on Route 66.
So, what was your background that you were writing about this?
I was writing some community histories. I had written all my life. As a child, I loved to write stories and plays, and then a number of jobs I had over the adult years were things that I needed to write, marketing materials, press releases, grant applications, that sort of thing, so I was still always writing. In 2009, I was in contact with Arcadia Publishing, and they were looking for a writer in the area to take on some projects, such as Alton, Edwardsville, some of our cities here in the Metro East. And so I did Alton first, which was a very rich experience. Alton's
a lot of history
wonderful history there.
All the way back to Mark Twain days.
Absolutely. And then I moved to Edwardsville, and I did a postcard history, actually, of Edwardsville from a woman's collection of postcards that she offered the use of. And while I was doing that postcard history of Edwardsville, there were so many business stories. People who had lived and had businesses, lived, died, had their dreams, hopes, successes on 66 in Edwardsville. And those stories kept creeping into the Edwardsville book. And I thought, I think this deserves its own book. So then I did Route 66 in Madison County, which of course covered Hamel, Edwardsville, etc. Then I did Route 66 in Springfield, our capital city, which was a joy to me because I had lived there twice, and once as a child, so I remembered a lot of the places that I was writing about. And from there I did Route 66 in Illinois, a book that covered our 300 miles approximately of it here in the state. I did that one with a co-author, and it just keeps growing. I'm just finishing Route 66 in Kansas. Mm-hmm. Which is a whole 13.2 miles.
Cuts that corner there.
It cuts that little corner, but it's a corner that's rich in history as well.
Now, just so the audience understands, because young people forget, that Route 66 is now Interstate 55, Interstate 44, Interstate 40, and Interstate 15, right? So 15 is that last little segment in California that would go down into LA.
To an extent, in some of the western states, Route 66 is actually under the interstate pavement. It is actually right on it. Now here in Illinois, a lot of our frontage roads are the old Route 66 lanes. But down in this area right here, one set of our 4-lane highway is old Route 66.
Right.
So in some areas it runs alongside it. And that's been kind of an issue over the years with the Renaissance, with the revival of Route 66, because it's under the jurisdiction of so many different entities. You've got parts of the old road that are under the interstate. You've got parts that are county highways, parts that are state highways, parts that are city streets. So that's been kind of an issue in signage and maintenance over the years.
Mm-hmm. Other than a sign that said, well, this used to be Route 66.
Exactly, and most of the 8 states now have very good signage. So you can follow a lot of it. There's about 85% that's still drivable all the way across the country.
Now, here's a really serious question, and then we'll get back to the lighthearted part. Other than to people our parents' age and our age, who really cares about Route 66?
We boomers care. We boomers care a lot because we remember the family vacation on 66, and we remember sitting in the back seat and following the maps as our parents drove. The roadside attractions that we stopped at, the tourist traps, all those things. Mm-hmm. Of course, it's our hope that the younger generations get interested in it, and we do our best to interest them. The Cars movies have done a lot.
The which movies?
The Cars movies, Disney Pixar's movies,
okay.
Cars.
Yeah, the cartoons.
And those have done a lot. And we call those kids the Cars generation because it's instilled a love for Route 66 in many young people.
Mm-hmm. So, going back again to the lighthearted part of this discussion, what is it that you found when you first started looking into the writings that you were doing and then discovered all this Route 66 information? Mm-hmm. What was it that came out that really you found interesting and exciting that got you like, wow, I need to write about this?
Well, you know, interestingly enough, even though I do bill myself as a fairly lighthearted writer, at least in my blog I do, but otherwise I consider myself a fairly serious writer. And I just kept thinking that Route 66 is just the embodiment of the majority of our 20th century history. The 20s, the early automobiles, the gangsters running up and down the highways, Prohibition years, the Okies leaving the Dust Bowl heading west as the Joad family did in Steinbeck's classic novel,
yes.
Grapes of Wrath. The military vehicles, the military traffic in the 40s, which ultimately broke down the pavement on many sections of the road and, of course, demanded then that we have thicker lanes, wider lanes, deeper concrete. And so as a student of history, it seemed to me that just really embodied our 20th century history. So that's where I got interested. The other thing that I found totally fascinating was that if I found a story about a family, a couple that started a little gas station or started a little motel, and they were in the middle of nowhere, it's hard to get anyone to listen to their story. But if I found that if they were along Route 66, or for that matter, if they were along one of the auto trails, the old Lincoln Highway, the old Dixie Highway, that all of a sudden people were more interested in their story. And I found it was a way that I could tell these people's stories, which are valuable, which all have value. It's part of our American culture, our American evolvement. And it was a way that I could tell those, and they were interesting to people.
Can you give us an example of a more interesting story of somebody who, like you just described, middle of nowhere, but it was still an interesting story?
Well, there's quite a few that come to mind. Lucille Hammonds in Hydro, Oklahoma. She and her husband had a gas station and tourist stop for many, many years. And he died, and she kept it running. And Hydro is a very, very small town in Oklahoma. And Lucille is sort of a legend. She died just a few years ago. And she ran that station all those years by herself. So there's numerous stories like that along the road of the women that hung on after their husbands perhaps passed away, and a lot of stories that repeat that theme.
Did she upgrade, or still have the old kind of pumps like from the old days?
There was some upgrade, yeah, beyond the visible pumps.
Yeah, because it's interesting. I mean, you know, I'm a photographer, and so I'll oftentimes be photographing when I'm out on the road,
Sure.
various things. Although you don't see those old pumps out there very often unless it's an old dead station.
Right.
Then you stop there and get some photographs of that, or museums. But a lot of those old stations, they went by the wayside when the larger company gas stations came along, didn't they?
Yes, that's correct. And as you summarized so nicely, as the interstate came through, which was a necessary progression for traffic in the United States, can you imagine the number of cars and the volume of traffic that we have now? Can you imagine all those trying to go down a small 2-lane, almost a country road? It's impossible. But it was kind of the death knell for a lot of those businesses. Some of the businesses were able to survive because they were still closer to the interstate, and perhaps there was an exit ramp that was nearby. But some of the areas where the bypass went miles off of the original road, of course it was, and sometimes there was no exit. Towns were bypassed and there was no exit, and those towns just literally died in a very short period of time. So
You make a good point about how important highway systems are to the economic life of communities along them. The legislatures might keep that in mind when they're talking about whether to fund repairs and expansions of modern roads. And to your point about, you know, a small country lane, in the late 20s and 30s and 40s, especially in the 30s, that was probably a very luxurious highway, or considered one.
it really was, and particularly on the eastern end of it, because we were paved earlier than the other states were. When Route 66 was designated in 1926, the push was on for those 8 states to get their sections of the road paved, so that, of course, it could be claimed as a modern highway from its eastern terminus to western. Some was dirt, some was gravel. It was kind of a variety. And in Illinois, from Chicago to St. Louis, we already had paved highway here because of Chicago and St. Louis being strong industrial cities for a long period of time. That corridor was already established. And that, in the early 1920s, that was State Bond Issue 4, Route 4, which we know as today. Now, Route 4 now, modern Route 4, is a different alignment than what it was then. It's been moved in various places. For instance, over by Marine, Troy, that way, that portion didn't exist in the early days. So rather than having to repave 300 miles through the state of Illinois, they simply chose Route 4, which was a direct route from Chicago to St. Louis anyway. And that was redesignated then as 66. But they knew they knew going in it would be temporary in some instances. For example, the Route 4 alignment, which goes southwest out of Springfield, Illinois, and came down through Auburn, Verdon, Carlinville, Gillespie, Staunton, they knew that wasn't going to last very long. So that was 1926 to 1930. And then it was moved over where they did build new pavement, construct new pavement down through Litchfield, Farmersville, that route. So Route 66 was constantly evolving because in the early days, the whole idea was to get from the heart of the city to the heart of another city, because in the downtown areas of the cities, that's where you would find your lodging, your hotels, your motels, the early gas stations. But then as traffic increased and people wanted to go farther and faster, they wanted to bypass the cities. So the idea of a bypass started to exist long before the interstate bypass. Around many cities, there's 2 or 3 early bypasses. So you've got that original alignment that came through a city.
Right through these various, like
Right.
Litchfield.
Exactly, like Litchfield. And Springfield, our capital, is a great example of that. From 1926 to 1930, Route 66 came in around the fairgrounds, and it came down right down 2nd Street in Springfield, right by the state capitol. So then you've got these bypasses moving slowly outward and away from the center of the city and to the
People were trying to get to St. Louis.
Exactly.
And they didn't want to stop in Springfield
and
or
get
Litchfield.
slowed down. So then, of course, we ended with the ultimate bypass, the interstate.
Well, you say that, but yet it's an evolutionary process.
Yes.
Because, I mean, if you want to take a longer look, before Route 66, before Route 4, there were a series of dirt trails that had been created by carts, wagons, horses that had gone from place to place, and an alignment just sort of developed because that was the best route for these horses or these carts to go.
Yes.
And then gravel, then paved, then most people don't know this, but the Interstate Highway System was actually President Eisenhower's
Correct.
idea, but they don't know why, because it goes back to his days when he was I believe a young captain, where he was ordered to take a convoy of trucks,
Yes.
basically from the East Coast to the West Coast, and it took him weeks.
Yes.
In those days, to go from coast to coast in the United States, it took weeks to do that. Why don't you
And
talk
that's
a little bit about
that's
that?
when that idea sprung forth, and that's not a real well-known story. So, and of course, who would know better than Eisenhower, prominent figure in World War II, the volume of military traffic that was existent in our country, even here in our country, because of the military installations and the factories. So,
Yeah, actually, if you look at the original bill that designates the building of the Interstate Highway System, it's actually the National Defense Highway
Correct.
System.
So-
And that's one of the reasons that Congress passed it, is for the defensive reasons. And of course, at that time, the Russians were well, there was. We're not going to go into the Cold War right now. But that did have a lot to do with it, making sure the military could get equipment from east to west quickly.
Correct. And of course, by that time, by the 50s, we were full blown into the family vacation.
Howard Johnson.
Yes, Howard Johnson. Howard Johnson was a definite figure, a definite player in the evolving.
Explain to some of the people who don't know, when we say Howard Johnson, what are we talking about here?
Well, we're talking about a series of restaurants and then hotels as well that the traveler could count on, because of course in the early days of traveling Route 66 there was no such thing as a chain, a McDonald's, where no matter where you went in you'd get the same coffee, the same biscuit, the same sandwich. Everything was mom and pop, and of course those of us that are hardcore Route 66 roadies, we support the mom and pops as much as we can along the way, because that's our thing. That's our throwback to the early days. But even before Howard Johnson, the man that really started the chain hospitality business was Fred Harvey. And Fred Harvey began with just simple lunch stops along the train stations. Well, Route 66 was basically built along the railroad lines. They followed each other. And so it was an easy thing to convert from a lunch stand for the passengers getting off the train to a lunch stand for the passengers on Route 66. So Fred Harvey was the man, particularly in the Southwest, although there were Fred Harvey locations as far east as Belvedere up near Chicago, but the majority of them were in the Southwest. So Fred Harvey and his company gets taught in marketing classes and hospitality classes, because he is the main example, and then Howard Johnson's another really good example.
Right, Howard Johnson came along and provided predictability.
He did.
So that when you went from one point to another point, You could go from one room to another room that was very similar. You didn't have to worry about whether there was going to be, what it was going to be like.
Exactly.
I mean, you go up somewhere, it could be horrible in there and you have no idea. But like you were saying about McDonald's or other chain restaurants, you know what's going to be in McDonald's before you ever got there.
Right, right. Along about that time, too, two other chains started up that had sort of an interesting history. One is the White Castle system, and the other is Steak and Shake. Steak and Shake, of course, the first location was up in Normal, Illinois, so not too far away from here. And those were both designed with that sparkling white exterior to signify purity, because years before that, the hamburger stand had a really bad reputation, and you really didn't know what you were getting. And so that's how that white exterior on those two chains came about. And Gus Belt, that started the Steak and Shake chain, that slogan that still accompanies the Steak and Shake name, the "Inside It Must Be Right." How that came about was Gus Belt wanted to reassure his customers that they were getting pure ground beef, and for a long period of time he ground the beef in front of the customers, in the front of the Normal, Illinois location. So that's how the "Inside It Must Be Right" came about.
We got about 7 or 8 minutes here, so I want to make sure that you have enough time to cover any areas that you want before we come to the end.
Thank you. I would
go
like
ahead.
to mention the event that we had in Edwardsville last
Go ahead.
weekend. We
So
called
that
it
was what date? Because this is
October 29th, 31st, Halloween weekend, which was Mayor Hal Patton's idea, and it was a good idea because we do have a lot of festivities in Edwardsville on Halloween. We coined it Miles of Possibility, which we thought was an appropriate event, and we decided to do something a little bit different. We tried a conference format. Route 66 enthusiasts are used to getting together for big weekend events, but they're usually festivals in the sense of vendors and bands in the street, that sort of thing. And there have been some small attempts at conferences that kind of paved the way for this one. So we gave it a try with a conference format with speakers and presenters coming in doing panel discussions and PowerPoints, and we had the debut of a new film actually. And we had some naysayers in the beginning that didn't think that this was a viable format for hardcore roadies, but I think that we proved that it would work and that it was popular. We had close to 150 participants that came to Edwardsville, which meant...
from where?
From all over the United States.
Really?
From 15 states in the U.S., and from Canada, and from Belgium. And the gentleman from Belgium actually was one of my presenters, and he spoke on travel on Route 66 through European eyes, which was...
How did he come to...
Well, the Europeans love Route 66. To them, it symbolizes freedom, and a lot of, I think, what they know about Route 66 has come to them through American movies, older American movies.
I was going to say it had to be American
Absolutely,
entertainment.
absolutely. So to them, it signifies freedom, jumping on a Harley, getting in a convertible, and driving the route. So that's how we came to have Belgian and Canadian people with us. But we were very, very satisfied. It meant it meant 100 hotel nights for our motels. It meant hundreds and hundreds of meals. So we feel it was good for the economy, and we feel that we began to put Edwardsville back on the Route 66 map, because it was on the original alignment, but Edwardsville is not a place that the hardcore Route 66 people go, because we don't have a lot of neon and original diners and that sort of thing left.
Is that going to change?
We hope so. We hope so. There's talk about 2 murals that may come in on a couple of the buildings on Edwardsville. So we're hoping that. And it was very gratifying to me to see the enjoyment on our guests' faces as they discovered the Wildey Theater, discovered our charming downtown, and they had a good time. They had a really good time, and Facebook has been buzzing now for over a week with photos and stories and anecdotes of the people that came and had a good time. So it made me feel it made me feel like all the work was definitely worthwhile.
Yeah, it's a good feeling, isn't it, when hard work turns out to to be like smiles.
Where the plan comes together.
Right. And the Wildey Theater that you mentioned, that's an old theater house. I don't know vaudeville or not, but definitely the earlier days of movies.
It did. That's a 1909, actually an IOOF building. And that's how it gets the name. Thomas Wildey was a leader in the IOOF movement. And so that's how the Wildey got its name. And it was restored and reopened in 2011, as you no doubt know. And it really did provide a great venue because we had a live band, we had the auditorium for a lot of our presenters, and then we had a second floor we could offer some other speakers, and our third floor was full of vendors and exhibitors.
Mm-hmm. I was actually in the Wildey Theater the day that it was hit by a tornado. It was quite an interesting experience, mm-hmm. and the building was damaged pretty severely after that, and it basically, well, you probably know the history that it just sort of sat there for a long time.
It did.
And the community of Edwardsville has done a lot of work in the last 10 years or
mm-hmm.
so to renovate and
mm-hmm.
get this back into a pristine condition.
Yes. Since the late 90s, they've been working toward the reopening. And when it reopened in 2011, it actually reopened 102 years to the day from its original opening in 1909.
Oh, is that right?
Mm-hmm.
I didn't know that. Yes, I think there was a small group of people, and backed by then Mayor Niebuhr, mm-hmm. who was very much a very strong supporter, and I believe that Mayor Patton is also a strong supporter of
He definitely is. He is. There's a lot of support, and the staff there is very professional. I had great respect for them before I did this event, but practically living in the theater for about 3 or 4 days and putting on this event, and how seamless everything was, and due to the staff in the Wildey. So they were great support. And I have to say I had a fabulous group of volunteers that, because I had no actual staff of my own, I did this as a volunteer conference director. So mm-hmm. the theater staff and my volunteers made it happen.
So in the last minute or two, is there anything more that you would like for the audience to know about Route 66 and the things that, the romance, as you put it?
I'd like people to know that they can still drive it, that they can get out there and they can drive better than 85% of it. There's still mom and pop restaurants. There's a lot of the old businesses that have been restored, and there are dedicated people there that aren't making a very big living, but they're there because they love the route. So if you'll get out and you will stop at those mom and pop motels
and
support them so that they stay there. There are a lot of wonderful museums along the route, and if it seems like too big of a chunk to do all at one time, do a small chunk. Do 1 or 2 states.
Thank you so much for being with us today. I certainly appreciate all that you've had to say about Route 66. To my audience, I've been speaking with Cheryl Eichar Jett. She is a historian, an author, a blogger about the story of Route 66, many of its stories. Route 66 is a route, as we said earlier, that has been in existence since the early part of the 20th century. We're going to upload this to YouTube, so if you missed any part of this, you go there and take a look. Thank you. Goodbye.